Walter Granger died a beloved husband, quiet, faithful, ordinary, until his widow found a journal hidden in a canvas bag. 13 names, 13 dates, and not a single one alive. She thought she knew the man she married. But the truth wasn't buried with him. It was written in his own hand. This isn't just a confession. It's a reckoning. The call came just before sunrise. Margaret stood in the pale light of her kitchen, hands wrapped around a chip mug, steam rising from weak tea. Her husband, Walter, had died 5 days earlier. A heart attack, sudden and unceremonious. He collapsed in the garage while changing the oil in their rust-bitten Chevy Silverado. 43 years of marriage ending with a dull thud on the concrete floor and the quiet click of a socket wrench rolling away. She hadn't slept much since. The silence had weight now. The house, their house, breathed differently, colder, still but not empty. The voice on the phone was gentle, a man from a local antiques dealer. Apparently, Walter had left something behind. A ledger, not an account book, the man clarified, but a large leather journal. Walter had brought it in months ago for appraisal, but never returned to collect it. Margaret frowned. Walter didn't write. He hated handwriting, said it was for people who liked to hear themselves think. But curiosity outweighed fatigue, so she drove into town, rain tapping her windshield like fingers with secrets. The man behind the counter at Larkspur Antiques handed her the book in a padded cloth bag. He said Walter had told him it was a family heirloom, though there were no markings on the outside. Just cracked brown leather, worn at the corners. Margaret thanked him, tucked it under her coat, and left without asking more. She didn't open it until that evening. It smelled of tobacco and dry paper. The spine creaked. Inside, pages of small, tightly written script. The handwriting was not familiar, too neat, too deliberate, but the voice was unmistakably Walter's. He wrote in first person, but it read like confession. Each entry began with a date. The earliest, March 3rd, 1992. Margaret scanned it at first, letting the words drift past a tired mind. But on the 4th page, something caught. A name, Carla, Junction Ridge, Lake House. Didn't struggle much. She froze. Carla was the name of a girl who'd gone missing the summer of '92. Local teenager. Vanished after a party near the lake. Margaret remembered the posters, the reward fund, the rumors that she'd run away. The town had grieved and forgotten. It had been a long time. Her hands shook as she flipped further. August 14th, 1994. Gas station girl. Dark hair. Saw my plates. Mistake. Never again on the highway. Margaret pressed her palm flat against the page. The words looked like fiction, like a disturbed man's fantasy. Except Walter wasn't disturbed. He was orderly, precise, predictable, or at least she had believed he was. But the journal continued. Emily, red scarf, just like she wore in church. Too bold, too proud, needed silence. That name twisted in her gut. Emily Reynolds, a girl from their congregation, vanished in 1997. She'd been in Walter's Sunday school class for a year. Margaret set the book down. The air felt thinner now, sharp around the edges. She sat motionless in the kitchen for hours, until the blue-gray light of morning crept across the linoleum floor. She didn't call the police. Not yet. Not because she doubted what she read, but because some part of her hoped there would be a logical explanation, a reason, a line between fiction and confession. She told herself maybe Walter had written stories. Maybe he had a private habit she never knew about. But in the back of the ledger, tucked between 2 pages, she found photographs. Polaroids, some faded, others warped from time, none graphic, all haunting. Girls, young, faces uncertain, some smiling, some not, all captured alone, in places that felt just out of time, forest edges, gas stations, roadside pull-offs. Some Margaret recognized. Carla, Emily, and one more, a girl named Dana Wheeler. She hadn't even been reported missing. Dana had worked the register at a roadside diner off Route 285. She'd served them coffee during a trip to her cousin's funeral. Walter had joked with her. Margaret remembered the way Dana laughed. Nervous, polite, the way Walter had left a big tip. Her photo was in the ledger, dated in Walter's handwriting. Dana, March 2002. Lucky I stopped for pie. Margaret vomited into the sink. She called Marion the next day. Her neighbor, retired cop. He didn't work homicide, never had, but he knew people. He came over without asking questions, and when Margaret handed him the book, he didn't speak for a long time. His hands trembled as he turned the pages. "You sure this is?" She nodded. They called the sheriff's office. Within a week, the house was swarmed. Crime scene techs in white suits. Detectives with questions Margaret couldn't answer. They searched the garage, the basement, the crawl space. They found a false wall in the shed behind the house. Behind it, a rusted tackle box filled with ID cards, bracelets, lockets. 13 total. Each one matched a name from the ledger. Walter's death was reclassified posthumously. No longer just a heart attack. Now, it was a final act of a man who knew the truth would catch up. The sheriff told Margaret that Walter had kept to a pattern, one that crossed multiple jurisdictions, that 3 counties had opened old files, that families were being notified. Margaret didn't cry at the funerals. She didn't speak to the press. But she kept the ledger, not for herself, but for the women who were no longer just names on posters. Because inside the final page, Walter had written something that would haunt her more than all the rest. It wasn't a confession. It was a prayer. "Lord, forgive what I've done. I was only ever trying to stop the noise." They wouldn't be quiet. They kept laughing. I made them still. I made them still. They buried him with a closed casket. Margaret insisted. Not out of shame, but because there were still people who didn't know. Neighbors, church friends, men from the Rotary Club who said things like, "He was always kind to me," or "I can't believe it." She didn't argue. She let them say what they needed to say. She wore black, nodded at the right times, and clutched a folded piece of paper in her coat pocket the entire time. Not a speech. A list. A list of names not carved into stone. By the following week, investigators from neighboring counties had arrived. The sheriff's office handed off the case to state-level authorities. A task force was created. They called it Operation Silencer. Margaret hated the name. Reporters began knocking. Some respectful, some not. One shoved a microphone in her face as she collected her mail. She said nothing. The next day, someone nailed a printed sign to the tree at the edge of her driveway. It read, "He's dead. She's not. Ask her why." She took it down with a hammer and burned it in the fire pit. But the question lingered. Why? The ledger didn't say. Not directly. It hinted at compulsions, at a desire for silence, at patterns of anger that Margaret had never seen in their marriage, or perhaps refused to see. He had been gentle, slow to speak, methodical in everything from brushing his teeth to mowing the lawn. He kept receipts, balanced the checkbook by hand, folded laundry in thirds. There had been no rage in him, not once in 4 decades. But control? Yes, always. He didn't like surprises. He didn't like noise during dinner. He didn't like when people cried in public, especially children. And he didn't like excess emotion. He had rules, quiet ones. One night, about 3 weeks after the story broke, Margaret got a letter. No return address. Inside, a newspaper clipping from 1992, yellowed with age, folded 3 times. It was Carla's photo, and a note scrawled at the bottom. He was my uncle. She was my sister's best friend. We always wondered why he stopped coming around after that summer. There was no name, no signature. Margaret folded it carefully and placed it inside the ledger. Then came the subpoenas. They wanted to know everything. His travel records, credit card history, old journals, receipts, even his sermons. Walter had been a lay minister for 2 decades, filling in at churches between pastors. They wanted tapes of his guest sermons. Margaret found boxes of them in the attic, old cassettes labeled in neat handwriting. She couldn't bring herself to listen. One agent did. 3 days later, he called her and asked if she had ever noticed the pattern. She said no. He explained that Walter often quoted the same verse, Proverbs 17, verse 1. Better a dry crust with peace and quiet than a house full of feasting with strife. He used it in at least 7 separate sermons, always as a lead into talking about obedience, submission, and the sacred discipline of stillness. Margaret didn't know what to say. They found his old truck in a storage unit registered under a shell company he created in 1996. Inside, a box of camping gear, a hunting knife, and a map with red pins placed across 3 states. Each pin matched a missing person case. The FBI got involved. Forensic psychologists began analyzing the ledger. Some thought it was a coded diary. Others saw it as a form of self-administered therapy. They all agreed on one thing. The writing was lucid, calculated. There were no signs of psychosis, no hallucinations, no mania, just controlled confession, laid out like logs in a fire. Each entry was dated, indexed. Some even included weather notations. It wasn't a madman's ramble. It was bookkeeping. Walter had kept track of every life he took with the same precision he used to log oil changes. Then came the breakthrough. In one entry, dated May 2005, he referenced a hill with a bent signpost. She almost got away. Investigators triangulated the detail, an old forestry trail in Gunnison County, Colorado. They brought in cadaver dogs. They found skeletal remains 20 yards from the trailhead. Female, estimated age, 17 to 19. No ID. A crack bracelet. Dental analysis pending. Walter had written, bright eyes. I couldn't bear them. I asked her to stop staring. The task force believed there were more. Maybe dozens. Walter had lived a quiet, unremarkable life. By design. No criminal record. No known altercations. He paid his taxes. Taught Bible study. Volunteered at food banks. And in the margins of every benevolent act, he left no traces of blood. Only silence. Margaret became a symbol, not by choice, but by circumstance. True crime shows wanted her. Victim advocacy groups reached out. Some women accused her of knowing. Others wept and thanked her for coming forward. She didn't feel brave. She felt broken. She kept a box by the fireplace, filled with mementos of Walter's good years. Photographs, anniversary cards, a seashell from their honeymoon. She hadn't burned them yet. She wasn't sure if she ever would. But she started writing. Not to tell her story. To tell theirs. The girls. Every page began with name. Every name began with silence. She started with Emily. Margaret remembered the last time she'd seen her. 15, maybe 16, wearing a yellow sweater with frayed sleeves and chipped purple nail polish. She had been sitting on the church steps after service, waiting for a ride that never came. Walter had offered to drive her home. Margaret had stayed behind to clean up coffee cups and hymnals, thinking nothing of it. Emily's family had spent years in limbo. They'd posted flyers, hired a private investigator, even held a vigil every year on her birthday. Eventually, people moved on. The family moved states. The flyers came down. The last trace of her was a blurry photo in a church bulletin. But now they had answers. Margaret asked the task force to let her meet the Reynoldses. She didn't want absolution, only the chance to look them in the eye and say what no one else could. That she was sorry. That she had missed something she should have seen. They met in a sterile room at the sheriff's office. Margaret wore gray. No makeup. She didn't bring the ledger, just a photograph of Emily from a church picnic. She handed it to Emily's mother, who held it to her chest and cried without sound. Margaret apologized. Not just once. Not just in passing. She said the words fully, without caveat or deflection. Mrs. Reynolds nodded. Mr. Reynolds stared into floor. After a long pause, he said, I thought it would make me feel better, knowing, but it just makes me tired. They left together in silence. Word of the meeting spread. Soon, other families began reaching out. Some angry, some grieving, some unsure of what they wanted from her. Margaret didn't claim to have answers, but she met them anyway, one by one. She made tea. She shared what she knew. She brought out the ledger when they asked. She began reading entries aloud, softly, like scripture, not to normalize, but to bear witness. The authorities continued their work. 7 more sets of remains were found across 3 counties, all within the zones Walter had marked. Most were too degraded for positive ID, but personal artifacts, a hair clip, a ring, a pair of prescription glasses, told their own truths. 2 bodies were identified through DNA. One was Carla. The other was Dana. Their funerals were held back-to-back. Margaret attended both, standing far from the family rows, dressed in black with a single white lily in her hands. She didn't speak. She just stood, like a monument to the unknowable weight of someone else's grief. Then came the lawsuit. A distant cousin of one of the victims filed a civil suit against Margaret, claiming she had known and failed to act. The media grabbed onto it like wolves. Articles circulated with headlines like "Did the Widow Know?" and "The Housewife and the Monster." Margaret didn't contest the suit. She sat for depositions. She answered questions. She showed her tax records, her journal entries, her grocery lists. It was invasive, humiliating, but she endured it. Eventually, the judge dismissed the case for lack of evidence, but the damage lingered. She no longer went into town. Her church disbanded. The Rotary Club stopped calling. Her friends faded into voicemail and half-hearted messages. The house grew quiet again, but this time, it wasn't Walter's absence that haunted her. It was the stories left behind. She began compiling a manuscript, not a memoir, a record. Each chapter was dedicated to a girl, not as a victim, but as a person, with the little things Margaret could salvage. She tracked down teachers, old friends, co-workers. She gathered quotes, photos, childhood drawings. She pieced together their lives from the shadows Walter had left behind. The manuscript took 2 years to complete. She called it Stillness is a Lie. It was published by a small press in Denver. It didn't become a bestseller, but it found its way into survivor groups, academic circles, and the shells of people who still believed in names, not numbers. Margaret donated all proceeds to the families. She received letters in return, some full of gratitude, others full of pain, but every one of them ended the same way. Thank you for not letting them disappear again. In 2027, the state of Colorado erected a memorial garden on the plot of land where the Reynolds old church once stood. 13 trees, no plaques, no benches, just a circle of stone at the center with the inscription, "For the one silenced, may we never confuse quiet with peace." Margaret visited once. She brought the ledger. She left it beneath the tree at the center, wrapped in canvas, sealed with twine. A note taped to the front read, "This is not forgiveness. This is memory." She walked away, wind stirring the hem of her coat, the leaves brushing against her legs like whispers from the past. And for the first time in years, she felt the silence settle around her, not as a cage, but as a space where something new might grow. He was born in the winter of 1949, in a farmhouse 10 miles outside of Grand Junction, Colorado. The delivery was quiet. No complications, no visitors. His mother, Ada, didn't cry when he came. She didn't speak much after, either. His father, Ellis Granger, was a farmer with a limp and an iron jaw. People said he was a hard man, the kind who believed silence made boys strong and work made them worthy. Walter was their only child. From a young age, Walter preferred quiet to company. He lined his toys in perfect rows, sorted by color and size. He hated when the dogs barked. He once locked a kitten in a toolbox overnight because its mewing irritated him. When asked about it, he blinked slowly and said he wanted to make it understand. There were no school friends, only long days in the fields, and longer evenings listening to his father sharpen tools in the barn. Discipline came swift in the Granger household. A missed chore meant an hour kneeling on dry corn kernels. Spilled milk earned a leather belt. Crying was forbidden. Any sign of weakness was noise. Ellis used the word like a curse. Stillness is respect, he'd say. Noise is rebellion. Walter learned early how to disappear into silence. To hold breath, still hands, unreadable face. By 14, he'd stopped reacting altogether. By 16, he could sit in a room without blinking for minutes at a time. He was praised for his composure, his obedience, his quiet strength. Teachers loved him. Girls were unnerved by him, though they couldn't say why. His eyes didn't wander. His mouth rarely smiled. But his grades were flawless, his church attendance perfect, and his shirt always tucked in. He went to seminary, briefly, studied theology and pastoral care before transferring to a state college, majoring in psychology. He said it was to better understand people. In truth, it was to better predict them. He met Margaret during a church retreat in 1978. She was warm, direct, with a laugh that filled up space. He liked her laugh at first. He liked how it made other people feel comfortable, how it smoothed edges and distracted from his absence of reaction. They dated for 6 months. He proposed without fanfare. No poetry, just a question, quiet and clean. She said yes. They were married the following spring. The first few years were uneventful. Walter worked odd jobs, maintenance at a hospital, then bookkeeping for a small freight company. Margaret taught 3rd grade. They bought a house on a quiet street, planted a garden. On the surface, they were a postcard, but inside, Walter was shifting. He complained about Margaret's music, about her habit of leaving cupboard doors ajar, about the sound of children playing in the park down the street. He installed thicker curtains, replaced a ticking clock with a digital one. When Margaret wanted children, he said they could barely afford it. When she pressed, he told her she was being emotional. She let it go. They never had children. In the early 90s, Walter began volunteering at the church more often. He helped organize youth trips, led Bible studies. He was praised for his steadiness, his responsibility, his fatherly energy. He built trust the same way he built everything else, slowly, meticulously, without excess. And when the ledger began, somewhere between the lake and the first missing girl, there were no signs, no blood, no panic, just gaps, just stillness. Detectives would later speculate about a trigger, a breaking point. But those who studied his case, the behavioral experts, the forensic psychologists, came to a more chilling conclusion. There was no snap. Walter didn't descend into darkness. He designed it, carefully, quietly. A man who learned as a child that noise meant punishment, and who spent his life erasing what he couldn't control. The task force investigating Walter's past reached into 4 states. Old missing person cases were re-examined. Cold case detectives worked around the clock. In Wyoming, they reopened a file on a girl named Tammy Lee Rourke, who vanished in 1999 after a summer Bible camp. She had been assigned to Walter's supervision during that week. Her mother, now in her 70s, said she remembered Walter. "Nice man," she said. "Too quiet, though. Never liked it when the kids giggled." Tammy's case had gone nowhere. No body, no evidence. Just a backpack found 3 miles from the camp. Now, her file had a new tab. Margaret followed each update like a ritual. She read everything, clipped every article. She began mapping out the towns Walter had traveled through over the years, cross-referencing it with missing girls aged 12 to 19. The pattern widened. Then one day, a letter arrived with no return address. Just a postmark from Montana. Inside, a photo. A girl, maybe 20 now. Smiling, alive. The note attached read, "I was supposed to be in the ledger, but I ran." The task force tracked the letter's origin. It led them to a woman named Lena, living under a changed name. She was 27 now. She said she'd been 15 when she met Walter, then going by the alias Mr. W. During a roadside church program, he was guest speaking it in Billings. He offered her a ride back to her foster home. Instead, he took her out to a camping ground near the state line, told her he needed help setting up before the other students arrived. She knew something was wrong when he asked her to sit still for obedience exercises. She said she excused herself to use a bathroom, slipped into the woods, and didn't stop running for 2 hours. She never told the police. She thought no one would believe her. She didn't even know his real name until she saw his photo on a news report. Her testimony confirmed something chilling. Walter had experimented. Before the kills, before the patterns, there were likely others who had slipped away, dismissed, silenced by disbelief or their own shame. Lena agreed to testify, to help close the open cases. She met Margaret once, hugged her, told her, "You're not responsible." Margaret didn't believe her, but she said thank you anyway. The media firestorm reignited with Lena's survival. It had been over 2 years since Walter's death, and the story had started to fade, from front-page horror to archived curiosity. But when Lena's account surfaced, everything burned again. National outlets ran her photo beside the old, pale mugshot of Walter Granger, now infamously known as a Ledger Man. Podcasts rebooted their series. Documentaries pushed out second seasons. Talk shows booked Lena before she had time to decide what she wanted to say. But she wasn't interested in fame. She gave her interview to only one person, the journalist who'd followed Margaret's story from the start. A quiet woman named Jules Rains, who ran a modest podcast called Below the Fold. Jules had no corporate sponsors, no flashy intro music, just the same old Shure microphone she'd used since college, and an obsession with telling stories that most people wanted to forget. Lena sat down across from Jules in a motel room just outside Missoula. She was nervous at first, but when the red light blinked on and Jules asked her what she remembered, the words came like a flood. She described Walter's calm voice, his detached instructions, the way he arranged the campsite like a ritual, folding tops, adjusting logs, brushing his hand together after placing each object just so. She remembered him asking if she liked quiet, and her saying yes, because she thought it was the right answer. She remembered how his face changed when she laughed at something, how he flinched almost imperceptibly, then smiled too broadly and offered her a test of obedience. When she fled, she didn't look back. That episode of Below the Fold became the most downloaded true crime podcast in 48 hours. People called Lena a hero, but what stuck most wasn't her escape. It was her final words on tape. He didn't kill because he was angry. He killed because silence was sacred to him. We were noise to be turned off. He didn't hate us. He just couldn't allow us to exist. The words chilled Margaret to her marrow. By then, she had moved from the house. Sold it. Quietly. The neighbors watched from behind curtains as boxes were loaded into a plain white moving truck. No interviews. No goodbyes. Just a forwarding address to a P.O. box in New Mexico. She had chosen Taos, a small adobe home with thick walls and no yard. It overlooked the desert in every direction, clean horizon lines, no trees to hide behind, no basements. She lived alone. She grew herbs. She adopted an old dog named Mercy who couldn't hear thunder. On most days, she didn't speak to anyone, but she wrote, not books now, letters, to the families who hadn't found remains, to the girls who were still missing, to the girls who had escaped. She sent them with no return addresses, sometimes with poems, sometimes with just the name of a flower. She no longer owned the ledger. It had been archived with the State Historical Society, sealed for 50 years per the request of the victims' families. But she had memoized it, every date, every name, every final word Walter wrote before closing each entry with the same line, still now. In 2030, the state proposed a public memorial, not just for Walter's victims, but for all unsolved cases involving serial predators that span state lines. It was to be erected near the trail where Carla's remains had been found. There were arguments in City Hall. Some said it glorified tragedy. Others said it was finally time. Margaret was asked to speak at the dedication. She declined. Instead, she sent a tape. Jules Rains played it live, through a crackling speaker beneath the pale sky. Margaret's voice was thin, older now. He used silence as a weapon. But silence isn't always violence. Sometimes it's reverence. So today I say nothing for myself. I say nothing for him. I say something for them. Their names were spoken. Their names remain. Still, but never erased. The crowd didn't clap. They stood in quiet, like a choir of stone, each one bearing their own memory of someone lost. Behind the crowd, a small plaque was unveiled. It held no names, just one line carved into bronze, to the voices that were taken and the silence they left behind. Margaret lived 5 more years. She died peacefully, alone, surrounded by the desert and a dog with no bark. When her house was cleared, among her few belongings was a wooden box filled with dried flowers and handwritten envelopes. Each was addressed to a girl's first name. No stamps, no dates, just a single pressed flower in each one, and one letter, sealed and never opened, addressed only to her. No one knows who that one was for, but it didn't matter, because she'd written it down, and that meant someone remembered. Someone always would.